So, picking up where we left off, if you remember, all the reforms that Muhammad Ali was promoting ultimately had one goal, which was to create a European-style army. And in this regard, we have to say Muhammad Ali was quite successful. He ended up with what was actually a fairly powerful army, which he would actually deploy on a number of occasions, initially on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan. Again, recalling that Egypt was for all practical purposes independent, but still nominally part of the Ottoman Empire. And at some point, the Sultan asked him to use his army to suppress a rebellion that was taking place in Arabia, led by the Wahhabi movement, which we're going to learn about later. The Wahhabi movement, very much associated today with Saudi Arabia. But in any event, he was very successful in suppressing that, then later helping the Ottoman sultans to fight against the Greeks, who at some point are going to break away from the Ottoman Empire to become independent. But then later he's going to use the army against the Ottoman Empire. Egypt will occupy Syria and Palestine between 1832 and 1839. And that will actually have a very disruptive effect on that region. He actually puts those territories under the control of his adopted son, who's the head of the military expedition into Syria and Palestine, a fellow named Ibrahim Pasha. And at some point, this army is actually going to threaten the existence of the Ottoman Empire. Until at some point Great Britain and France intervene on behalf of the Ottoman Empire and make it clear to Egypt that they are to not only forego any attack on Constantinople, but also to evacuate Syria and Palestine, which at that point returns to Ottoman control. Basically, again, I think we already mentioned that the British are, at this point, had developed a policy of supporting the Ottoman Empire. The fear being that if it should collapse, it would upset the balance of power because then Russia would take advantage. So in any event, reform would continue after Muhammad Ali in Egypt. After he died, Ibrahim Pasha served as a regent briefly in 1848. He died shortly thereafter, at which point the viceroyship went to Muhammad Ali's grandson Abbas. He actually was kind of against reform, so that did kind of interrupt the process, if you will, temporarily. But he only reigned until 1854 when he was murdered. So reform would pick up after that, and it would really speed up after 1863 under a fellow named Ismail, who would rule as Khedive or viceroy until 1879. So he's going to really kind of speed up the whole process of modernization. Unfortunately, in order to do it, he's going to put the country heavily in debt. But he really wanted to see Egypt become almost European. He's very famous for once stating, "My country is no longer in Africa. We're now part of Europe." And he will do a lot of things. Would be the creation of the Suez Canal, which was opened in 1869, primarily the work of French engineers, but belonging to Egypt. But this, by the way, gives you a pretty good idea of the kind of spendthrift that Ismail was. I mean, he blew 2 million Egyptian pounds, which was a considerable sum at the time, just to celebrate the opening of the Suez Canal. Never mind what he spent on it. Now, part of the problem is back then, if you were borrowing money, the interest rates, and he's borrowing money mostly from Europe, from European governments, from individual banks, even wealthy individuals who are investing in Egypt. But very often the interest rates are absolutely beyond belief. I mean, there's really nothing comparable today. They're kind of designed to keep you in debt. And so he's just going to keep getting deeper and deeper into debt. Things like building the Khedivial Opera House, for instance, something that he could ill afford. That was actually built in connection with the celebrations of the opening of the Suez Canal for the performance of an opera that was actually written for that occasion by the very famous composer Giuseppe Verdi, an opera named Aida, which actually never gets performed in the opera house but becomes a very famous work of his, even though it was written for the occasion. By the way, you can't visit this opera house today because it burned down in 1971. But just looking at this scene, you can kind of see how Cairo would have looked very European at this point. But again, the problem was that he was borrowing money to do this. During the 1860s, the first half of the 1860s, this actually wasn't altogether a bad idea. There was a cotton boom. The price of cotton had shot up because of the American Civil War. So Egypt had effectively cornered the market on cotton, and they were able to get loans at very low interest rates. But unfortunately, after the American Civil War came to an end, the market for cotton was open coming from there. That meant that the price of cotton went down, interest rates went up, and eventually the debt just became unmanageable. At some point, Ismail started to raise taxes in the hopes of, kind of just paying the interest, never mind the principal. Eventually, he was forced to sell Egypt's share in the Suez Canal Company to the British, who ended up with 44% of stock, kind of the controlling share at that point. So, I mean, that was actually rather unfortunate. That meant that the British effectively now own the canal. And in spite of all this, in spite of the debt just kind of getting bigger and bigger and his inability to deal with it, he still kept spending money. This time primarily in connection with military expeditions, for instance, fighting alongside the Ottoman Empire in the Russo-Turkish War, and then later invading Ethiopia, right? All things that he could ill afford. And as you might imagine, the people he owed money to, and particularly the British and French, whether talking about their governments or individual banks, they were becoming greatly concerned that at some point Egypt would default on what it owed. And that eventually led to them imposing British and French control over Egypt's finances through the institution known as the dual financial control. Right, just kind of the feeling that Egypt couldn't be left to its own devices. So they basically forced Ismail to accept a constitutional ministry that included a British official as Minister of Finance and a French minister as Minister of Public Works. That would be as if today, for instance, we became so indebted to China that they imposed Chinese control over the Department of the Treasury. Of course, militarily, we would be able to resist that, but Egypt was not in a position to do that with respect to the British or French. Eventually, the British decided that Ismail wasn't even sufficiently cooperative, which, not sure what else they expected from him, but in any event, they forced him to step down in favor of his son Taufik in 1879, someone they felt that they could exercise greater control over. We'll come back to the situation in Egypt in a bit, but the one last thing I'd like to say in connection with this is that by the 1870s you do start to see kind of a growing sensibility of Egyptian nationalism. And a lot of this is, in a sense, kind of a reaction to perceived foreign control. Right? There's nothing like a kind of them to help create a sense of who the us is. Right? So this is going to become a kind of major factor moving forward. Before we look at that, though, let's see what's going on in the Ottoman Empire in the meantime. So we kind of left off that the Ottoman Empire, at least from a military point of view, is in a state of decline, very rapidly losing territory. Something kind of illustrated in this map. You can see that early on, coded in yellow, losing Bessarabia to Russia, then losing territories like Moldavia, Wallachia, territories that will eventually become part of Romania, and eventually they're going to lose pretty much everything except roughly what corresponds to the modern state of Turkey, though a lot of that won't happen until the First World War. In any event, at some point, there is definitely a perception within the Ottoman government, inclusive of sultans, that something needs to be done. The first really serious attempt at reform will be under Sultan Ahmed III, who rules from 1703 to 1730, right? So this is even before Napoleon's invasion, right? The event of which would really bring home this kind of sense that the Middle East had fallen gravely behind Europe. But even before that, right? So there's an attempt at reform under Sultan Ahmed III during the period 1718 to 1730, sometimes called the Tulip era because of his love of the tulip, a flower associated very strongly with Turkey and the Dutch. Both claim to have actually genetically created the tulip. I'm just going to not get involved in that debate. But in any event, part of the reason he was able to initiate reform was because it was a kind of one of the few times where the Ottoman Empire wasn't actually in a state of war. Following the Treaty of Passarowitz, which had seen them again lose territory to Russia. And so the reform is primarily aimed at, kind of improving the military. Relative to reforms that will come later, they're somewhat modest, but it is kind of the first serious attempt. A more serious attempt at reform will be under Sultan Selim III, and this is after Napoleon's invasion, when this kind of sense that the Ottoman Empire, the Middle East, had fallen behind Europe becomes much, much more acute. And the focus here will be on military reform. Uh, but let's just say, I mean, the extent of the reform that he wants to carry out is sufficiently great to upset both the ulama and the Janissaries, right? And the Janissaries being kind of an elite fighting force who are particularly concerned about any attempt to reform the army along European lines, which would mean kind of creating an infantry-based army, which would, probably undermine their kind of privileged status, not just militarily, but within society. And you might remember that I talked about how Muhammad Ali had a similar problem with the Mamluks, and he dealt with this by assassinating them. And that might have seemed pretty harsh, but perhaps Sultan Selim III is wishing that he had done the same thing. The Janissaries will eventually rise up in revolt and force Selim to step down and even imprison him. So that doesn't go very well. That brings us to the Tanzimat reforms. Tanzimat reforms is going to be really involve a kind of major overhaul of the Ottoman Empire in pretty much just about every respect, right? Except perhaps economically, but politically, socially, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of educational institutions, in terms of the status of Ottoman subjects. Tanzimat literally means reorganizing. It's Arabic for reorganizing, tanzim, tanzimat the plural. And these reforms will actually be carried out over a period of time beginning in 1839 up until 1876. The two sultans most involved will be Mahmud II and Abdülmecid, who together ruled from 1808 until 1861. Though in some ways, I mean, they're not really the main driving force behind this. I mean, they definitely approve of the reforms, but they are pretty much being conducted and carried out by a series of viziers. And I don't expect anyone to remember these individuals, but we're going to talk about the Tanzimat reforms. They deserve mention. The four are Ali Pasha, Fuad Pasha, Ahmed Shevdet Pasha, and Midhat Pasha. And by the way, the term Pasha is kind of just kind of an honorific reflective of their political status. And with regard to the Tanzimat, we're really talking about a huge array of different kinds of reforms and so forth. But there are a number of decrees that kind of stand out as promoting kind of defining principles underlying the reform. And these would be the Hati Sharif of Gulhain, the Hati Humayun, and the nationality law. And collectively, probably the most important principle has to do with the idea of religious equality. So up until now, first of all, everyone was a subject of the Ottoman Empire. Muslims made up the political mainstream. and the other religious groups were semi-autonomous via the millet system, if you recall. Right? So the idea now is, by way of transformation, instead of being Ottoman subjects, right, who are defined in connection with the Sultan in different ways, either via kind of the Islamic courts and Sharia if you're a Muslim, or the millet system if you're not. Everyone now is to be an Ottoman citizen of equal political status, with equal political rights, but also equal political obligations, regardless of religion, right? So religious equality. Um, and this is in some ways going to prove difficult to implement, not just because initially many Muslims are a bit resistant to the idea that non-Muslims should be considered political equals, but also many Christians, for instance, were quite happy with the millet system. Bearing in mind they will have more political rights as Ottoman citizens, but also obligations such as serving in the Ottoman military, something until then they hadn't had to do. Of course, the reforms will also involve a lot of kind of infrastructural development, building of schools, development of a secular curriculum that would be applied equally throughout the empire, and a lot of military reforms. Um, but again, right, so I mean, a lot of non-Muslims are not going to be happy about this as well. I should mention also that while certain taxes that they had to pay as non-Muslims are abolished, um, that doesn't quite offset the new responsibilities that now adhere to them. You'll see at the top of the slide the term Ottomanism, and that kind of reflects the idea that in connection with the idea that everyone is now politically equal, regardless of religion, but also regardless of ethnicity, regardless of what language you spoke, the reformers are going to try to promote the idea that everyone is somehow equally nationalistically part of this Ottoman identity. They tried to kind of transform the term Ottoman, which historically really referred to the House of Osman, the kind of ruling dynasty, and perhaps might be extended to include certain political elites who, operated under a certain kind of governing tradition or culture. Right? They're now kind of expanding the term Ottoman to refer to all citizens. And the idea of Ottomanism, that there is such a thing as an Ottoman national identity. But this isn't really going to stick for a number of reasons, not least being that during the 19th century, nationalism is really beginning to take off. And the different peoples of the Ottoman Empire ultimately reject Ottomanism in favor of whatever national identity they feel affiliated to, whether it's Bulgarian or Greek or Albanian or later on Arab, Turkish, and so forth. Right? So this never really works out. Now, the driving force, right, the bureaucrats who are most actively promoting reform, and this kind of ties in with the article that you had to read by Weicker, are often referred to as the young Ottomans. Many were actually educated in Western universities. Many of them see the ultimate goal being a kind of constitutional monarchy, except with a sultan instead of a king. They feel that this would provide a solution to one of the major problems at this point is kind of the rise of nationalism, which is really dividing people in the empire. So they're kind of hoping if everyone has equal rights that they might be willing to, kind of stick with the Ottoman Empire. But that isn't really going to happen, right? Because I mean, ultimately, these different nationalist movements aren't simply about, somehow a feeling that they lacked equality within the Ottoman Empire, and if somehow you took care of that, everyone would be happy. In any event, we could say the Tanzimat reforms conclude with the actual creation of an Ottoman constitution in 1876. Alongside the first Ottoman parliament, they have elections, you have representatives from different parts of the Ottoman Empire. Now, from the article that you read by Weicker, he kind of offers a number of reasons as to why he feels the reforms ultimately failed. I would just suggest that there are some historians who would contend that it isn't entirely accurate to say the reforms failed. In a sense, it's really hard to fully evaluate that because what ultimately brings the Ottoman Empire to an end is the First World War. And one might well imagine that if perhaps the First World War hadn't have happened, maybe these reforms and the kind of changes that they initiated would eventually have worked to the benefit of the empire. And certainly in 1876, there was actually kind of a feeling of rejoicing and, kind of a sense that perhaps the Ottoman Empire could carry onward. There were, many people who felt very happy about the creation of an Ottoman parliament. So who knows? Maybe things would have turned out differently. Though before we get to the First World War, we should note that 2 years later, both the Constitution and the Parliament would be suspended by the new Sultan as of 1876, Abdul Hamid II. Um, that doesn't mean that there wouldn't be any reform after that, but he would rule as an autocrat. There certainly wouldn't be any kind of political reform. It should be noted, part of the reason he suspended the Constitution Parliament is because the Ottoman Empire suddenly found itself at war with Russia. And from his point of view, it seemed that the Parliament was incapable of making a decision in a timely fashion to deal with the impending threat. But in any event, he definitely wasn't a big fan of democracy or representative government. He preferred to rule as an autocrat. Tried to kind of re-emphasize Islam as a basis of loyalty to the Sultan, which would kind of be going back to the way things used to work back at the let's say beginning of the 19th century. Um, and well, we'll come back to developments in the Ottoman Empire. There's going to be quite a number of people who are unhappy with this development, and eventually that will lead to his overthrowing. But that's going to be in the 20th century. That brings us to the one part of the Middle East we still haven't looked at, developments in Iran under the Qajar dynasty, and that's pretty much where we left off. Um, and so that dynasty became established in the middle of the 18th century. And they were somewhat successful. One thing they did do is they relocated the capital to Tehran, at that time a village near the ruins of the ancient city of Rey, Shahr-e-Rey. And in 1796, that's pretty much when they formally became a full-blown Iranian dynasty with the crowning of Aja Muhammad Khan as Shah 1 year before his death. So that brings us to the Qajar dynasty, and it's kind of a nice, I think, painting of the Shah consulting with his ministers. Their chief problem is not that different from the Ottoman Empire, right? This kind of recognition that they've fallen behind Europe, as with the Ottoman Empire, increasingly feeling threatened by the imperial policies of the European powers. In the case of the Qajar dynasty, primarily their concern is with Russia, which is an expanding empire into Central Asia, territory that used to fall within the sphere of influence of Iran. But also, they're being squeezed from the south by the British, who are expanding in India. And they will never be occupied by either of them, but it comes pretty close to that. At some point, both Russia and Britain have become so influential in Iran that in an effort to avoid a conflict between them, they divide Iran, or Persia, we might say, into three different zones, right? One that is a Russian zone of influence, one that is a British zone of influence, and then in the center, a kind of neutral zone, so in theory, independent. But as you might imagine, this is a pretty sticky situation to be involved in. So related to this, there really is this kind of sense that Iran needs to somehow modernize along European lines, in particular needs to develop its military. In the meantime, kind of playing the British and Russians off one another. So with respect to reform, the one individual who really stands out in this regard, the first one to make a serious attempt at kind of a modernization along Western lines, is Nasser ad-Din Shah, who rules from 1848 to 1896. So during his reign, we start to see the introduction of Western science and technology, a kind of development of a kind of more secular European-based curriculum, and the construction of schools. So, in some ways, it's a pretty modest beginning, but it is the first kind of movement in that direction. And again, in the meantime, trying to kind of play the British and Russians off one another in order to preserve Iran's independence. And just kind of as an aside, we might note one kind of interesting development in connection with this as the British expand northwards in India, and as they become more and more concerned with Russian expansion to the north, they literally cobble together, kind of create a state out of a number of different tribes, different territories, what would become Afghanistan. Right, so the origin of Afghanistan in some ways is as a buffer state created by the British in order to protect India against Russian expansion. And of course, Russia at this point expanding into much of Central Asia. And in fact, later on, many of these territories will constitute socialist republics, but they were also part of the Russian Empire prior to the creation of the Soviet Union. So territories like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. And I think I've mentioned that my wife is actually from Kyrgyzstan, so I've had the pleasure of going there many times. A very beautiful country. Very interesting too, because you do see elements of influence coming from kind of Persian influence, Russian influence, and also from China. So a real kind of hodgepodge of influences, to some degree reflective of the developments that we're looking at here. In any event, this is a good place to stop, and this concludes our lecture of encounters and confrontation.